Hi there, it's Gabrielle Nicolay from SpeechKids, where we teach little kids to talk and help parents understand their little kids. And today I'm so happy to be reconnecting with my former coworker, Melanie Pensak. Melanie, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Gabrielle. It's amazing to be here with you again.
Melanie is an amazing speech therapist, I can say, since I have seen her work. But Melanie, you're doing some other interesting things these days. And so I'm going to sort of let you take it over from here and we'll talk about that.
Sure. Thank you so much. So I am a speech and language pathologist. I've been practicing now 16 years, which is very hard to believe. And I've worked in pediatrics mostly with the, early intervention and younger population over the years, and really have loved that work and found so much joy working with families really closely over that time. I would say about now, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I started to really get interested in mindfulness and meditation practices and nature practices, and started to see how that really integrated lovely into our work with kids and with families. And so over the years now, I've done a lot of trainings and decided to really start to bring in mindfulness work to therapists, to the families and parents and caregivers of children, and also integrating in mindfulness activities with the kids in sessions as well. So it's been beautiful. Yeah.
I'm gonna pause you for a second, stop you for a second, because let's define our terms. Yeah. What is mindfulness anyway? Does it mean I just sit there and like try to meditate?
Thank you for bringing that into the conversation. So mindfulness is really about being in the present moment experience. So knowing what's happening in that moment and having a kind attention to it. So not judging what's happening, really holding it lightly and with care. And so that's my general go-to definition for what mindfulness is. However, when we say mindfulness, there's a bit of confusion because it implies that it's all happening in the mind. And actually, mindfulness is really about releasing the thoughts, limiting beliefs, habits of mind, and anxiety and worry that we have, and returning back to the body, which is where all of life is happening. And so mindfulness is really about becoming more embodied, knowing our breath, knowing how life is happening right here in this vessel.
This is so interesting because for modern humans, we have been spending so much time, probably generations now, getting out of our bodies and into our heads. And if you think about most modern jobs, I'm sitting in here in front of the computer, as are you, right? And we're used to just kind of typing and typing and typing. And I might not stand up for several hours. And you want to talk about being out of your body. If you stand up after a couple of hours, your hips are stiff, and I'm a woman of a certain age, but things are stiff, things are not moving right. And I haven't been in my body at all. And so this, what is it, dichotomy of sort of, being up here versus being down here and fully embodied is really, it turns out to be very important. And you only kind of notice it when you haven't been doing it.
Absolutely. Yes. And we've become so disembodied as we live inside and work inside, and as our lives have really transitioned into this computer-based world right now. So it really feels even more important now than ever to remember to practice mindfulness. And it's called mindfulness practice for a reason, because we need to practice remembering. We forget all the time throughout the day. And instead of judging ourselves for forgetting and getting disembodied, we use mindfulness as an invitation to, here's an opportunity to remember, to come back into the body and reset and rebalance, because it helps us then to move into whatever we're doing in the world or who we're talking to with a different sort of energy and presence, which is so important with the work that we're doing as speech pathologists and working with families and kids. We want to be balanced, grounded, in tune with what's happening. And it's hard to be in that place if we're not really in our bodies and feeling grounded.
So you work with 3 different very closely overlapping populations. And one of those is the therapists. And so you work with therapists, you work with parents, and you work with kids. And so I'm hoping we can sort of touch on why and how mindfulness is important. And you alluded to it with the therapist, but say more about that. Like, why can't I just kind of be, I mean, anybody who is, and are you working mostly with speech language pathologists or other kinds of therapists as well?
Speech, OT, and PT.
Okay, so related service.
Yeah.
Anybody who's a related service provider knows that you can't phone it in, particularly in pediatrics. Like, you actually, part of the reason I love what I do, and the reason that I do it with very young children, is because it puts me in the present moment. You have to be in the present moment, because if you're not, they know it and you're not getting anything done. So can you say more about how you work with therapists?
Absolutely. It really started through my own personal experience as a therapist over the years, starting to see how I was getting a little stuck in my mind and controlling about goal achievement, about expectations from parents and schools, and really starting to see that my work was going in a different direction and not really being sure how to work with that. Also feeling some burnout, from productivity and seeing so many clients, and also seeing my own emotional reactions to other people's emotional reactions. So it was getting difficult for me to always stay grounded when a parent was stressed or when a child was stressed, or, in a school meeting when I clearly had some sort of information to share that was a different opinion of someone else's. And I could feel that discomfort and in all of those areas, and was thinking, how can I work with this and really use this as something that can teach me how to be more emotionally regulated, how to be more grounded, and how to take care of myself. Because as therapists, it's so natural for us to have that sort of desire to help and to give. And yet, if we are not refilling our own bucket, we really will feel the effects of burnout, which is a shame because we don't want people to leave this field. We have the skill set that helps so many.
That's super interesting. And that actually leads right over to parents, because, and most of the people watching this will be parents, some therapists as well, which is, we don't have time for what you're talking about. Sounds a lot like self-care, and I don't have time for self-care. Because people need me. I have a job. I have too much to do. It's never finished. And then more people need me. So how does that play?
Definitely want to honor the fact that parents are busy people and they are managing a lot. And there is this idea with mindfulness practice that it's only seated on the cushion in silence. And that's not always the case. So formal meditation can look like that, but there are ways to bring mindfulness into our days. And we can do it in very simple moments and very short moments. Short moments many times adds up to beautiful understanding. So one of the examples that I tell parents who come to me with this is to use a technique called stop. So like a stop sign, STOP. And stop is when there is a moment where you're feeling triggered or a power struggle or something anxious or intense is happening, to stop. So stop and pause for the S, and then take a breath and just do that. And then observe what's happening in your body. So did your stomach tighten? Did your face get hot? Are your hands clenched? Are you feeling really tight with what's happening? Observe that. And then the P is to proceed with care. So what's needed in that moment? Do you need to just feel your feet on the ground and take a deep breath before you respond to your child? Do you need to make sure your child's safe and put them in a safe place? Do you need to excuse yourself and get a glass of water or go to the bathroom for a moment? There are these simple steps that going through that could be happening in seconds, or you could extend it out and go into a deeper inquiry. So the idea is that when you start to see, I'm triggered, or I'm stressed, or this is happening in my mind, that repetitive story of worry, oh, I'm going to stop it, and go through that regularly and see how that helps and impacts your life.
Now, there are going to be people watching this who say, I don't have time for that. What do you say?
Breath takes a second.
You got to breathe,
You
people.
gotta breathe. We're always breathing. The breath is breathing us. And it is the most portable tool that we have. And we don't need anything extra. You don't need that fancy app. You don't need a toy. You don't need a coach or a mentor. Just the breath that's always with you. It is a tool that's there that is ready to be noticed and used to help us regulate.
There's, if you've read any Daniel Siegel, he's a pediatrician, trained as a pediatrician, but also big on mindfulness at this point, who will teaches this notion of the hand brain model, and lids being flipped, and this being your prefrontal cortex, this being your survival brain. When lids are flipped, nobody is thinking clearly. If we can take that breath, if we can do stop and keep this portion, this is your prefrontal cortex, this is the thinking part of your brain, keep it online, then that sets in motion a whole different turn of events that makes, the stressful situation turn out differently. But that mindful pause is the key to accessing, or to continue to access, your thinking mind instead of your lizard brain, as some people like to call it. Super, super important. And yet, it feels like we don't have time for that. And yet, if we don't do it, then the result could be a 45-minute meltdown. And we really don't have time for that. So when you are, that will lead us right to the kids. How are you using this practice with kids, and how young can it go? Tell us more about that.
Sure. So I use a play-based approach. Susan Kaiser Greenland, she wrote Mindful Games. There are a bunch of cards. There's 55 cards in her mindful activity deck that I use with children, along with other different children's games. And these activities are taught not in the meltdown. They're not taught during those times where things really just need to be contained and kept safe. These are games that are fun and interactive that help children to really feel into their body, understand their own experience, learn where their emotions are happening in their body, and help them to see that their thoughts in their mind are just like clouds floating through the sky. They're not really always true. It really helps with that sort of growth mindset versus fixed mindset. So the practices when I work with kids can be adapted who I see children sometimes ages 5, depending on their ability to listen and attend and play. And then I work with children, up into the teenage years, because all along the way, based on their development, there's different ways that they resonate with the practices. So younger kids, it's short little games. Sometimes it's 5 minutes or, incorporated into the beginning and the ending of a session. Sometimes it's periodic check-ins. What's happening in your body? What's happening in your heart? What's happening in your mind? Just sort of bringing it into the conversation. And then with the older children that I see, I really do more in-depth conversation about meditation and mindfulness. Some children really love to be guided in a formal practice. Some kids don't, and we do more body movement and inquiry and sort of relational mindfulness games. So it's really designed based on the kids' goals and their needs and their interests. That's a big part of it. We don't want to ever force meditation on anybody, and really keep it open as something to explore what's happening in your own life.
I think sometimes these strategies get seized on by therapists, parents, by adults in power, as, you need to go do your mindfulness practice. And tell me if you agree. If we're saying that, then we need to go do our mindfulness practice.
Completely agree. I have seen such blossoming happen within families when the parents are really starting to engage in the mindfulness practices themselves along with the children, versus it just being something that happens in therapy or in school. And with the work that I do, I really work with the kids one-on-one, but then I am working with the parents in an ideal situation So they are understanding the same concepts as they go through the programs.
Mhm.
And it really creates a common language and a deeper understanding of what's happening relationally in that situation.
Mhm. It's so
Mhm.
interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking about our kids on the spectrum who really have trouble learning how to think about others.
Yes,
But part of that is also that they don't know how to think about themselves.
right.
And so, if we start to unwind that a little bit, so that's kind of one part of it. The other part of it is, in many cases, either with kids on the spectrum or not, kids who are having any kind of speech clarity issue, any kind of language issue, which is what we're in the business of treating, um, we require an awareness of one's body movements that may not be accessible to some of these kids without explicit instruction, right? Kids have to be aware of what their lips are doing or what something sounds like. But if they don't know where sound comes in,
Mhm.
right, or how to not even how to process that information because it's getting processed automatically, but to understand that we listen with our ears, for example, that brings a completely different way of perceiving the world.
Absolutely. What's coming up for me with this comment is, so many of the kids don't realize that their facial expressions are happening or that the emotions are felt in the body. So I can maybe see that the child's annoyed, irritated, disinterested. However, they're not in touch with the fact that that might be feeling like some heat in the face or a scrunching of the face or a turning of the body. So as a therapist, if I have a mindfulness background, I'm able to cue them to point it out for them and reflect that back to them. They start to internally realize, oh, I was actually, like making a face, or I was feeling nervous about that request from the teacher and my belly was jumping, and then they can start to articulate that. So it makes them more independent. And as parents, if we're able to also then give them that information, it helps them to internalize and become more independent in those areas versus relying on the external feedback all the time.
And this is a big deal too in terms of interoception, which doesn't get talked about nearly enough, but this awareness of one's own internal state, right? That mindfulness is a teaching tool to teach us all, I mean anybody, how to recognize one's own internal cues
Mhm.
about what's happening. And when we can do that, then we can identify it. I mean, we all want our kids to talk, okay, but we need to give them the tools with which to we need to help them identify what it is that they want to talk about. How are they going to proceed through the world? What is this experience like for them?
And then they start to notice, kids too, that I understand when I'm kind of irritated or bored, my body feels like this and looks like this. They start to bring that into their social interactions. Then they can start to have that perspective of, oh, that friend is actually not looking at me and kind of tapping their fingers. Maybe they're bored too. And then they can start to adjust what they're talking about or bring in a question, a clarifying question, or compromise of some sort. So having that internal understanding can then help them to see what's happening in their peers and with their friends, which is so important, especially during these days when the social contact is limited.
Yeah, that's like a whole other conversation is coming up in September about what's going to happen. But and we will do that another time. Say more about mindfulness as a practice. Are we ever finished?
Mm, great question. In my experience so far, no. It's something that continues to deepen and be refined over time. So there's, the initial understanding of, oh, maybe I'm triggered, or I'm seeing, that this emotion is happening in my body. And then over time, you start to feel it in different ways and in different situations. And the practice sometimes starts out to be more internally focused and more about the me, but it actually leads into the we. You start to then see how, oh, all of these practices help us relationally out out into the world. And that is a never-ending practice of how to interact with others, with colleagues, families, schools, peers.
That is a beautiful place to leave it. Thank you. This has been fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so much.